The great hall of Thornfeld had never been this silent. 300 wolves stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the vaulted stone ceiling, and not a single one of them breathed. Every pair of eyes in the room pressed into her like heated iron. She stood alone in the center of the hall, her wrists bound in ceremonial cord, the rough fibers biting into her skin, and the only thing keeping her upright was the stubborn, furious refusal to let them see her knees buckle. Severin stood on the dais above her, her mate, her king, the man whose slow, steady heartbeat she had fallen asleep to for the past 6 months. He would not look at her. His gaze was fixed on some point above her head, his jaw set so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin from 15 feet away. He had not met her eyes once since the guards brought her in. The evidence is clear. His voice carried through the hall the way it always carried, low and absolute and impossible to argue against. Letters were recovered from your personal study bearing your handwriting. Correspondence with the Alpha of Grimarsh offering intelligence on our troop positions, supply routes, and the rotation of our border patrols. Information that could only have been obtained by someone with unrestricted access to the royal archives. I did not write those letters. Aelith's voice broke, and she hated herself for it. She hated the way it echoed off the stone walls, thin and cracked and desperate, while his filled the room like thunder. Severin, please. I brought those letters to you because I found them hidden in Renard's private study. I told you exactly what they contained. I told you what he was planning. The name landed in the silence, like a stone dropped into still water. 300 heads turned almost imperceptibly toward the man, standing at the king's right hand. Lord Renard, first advisor to the crown, childhood companion of the king, and the most trusted voice in Thornfeld. He did not flinch. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression heavy with carefully measured sorrow, the portrait of a man watching something painful but necessary unfold. I wish it were not true, Renard said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the front rows to hear, forcing the rest to lean forward. I confronted her myself when I first discovered the correspondence. She denied everything, of course. When she realized I had found her out, she took a set of the letters and claimed she had discovered them in my quarters. He shook his head, the picture of reluctant honesty. A clumsy diversion, but I understand the impulse. She was desperate. He is lying. Aelith heard herself say the words, but they sounded distant, like someone else was speaking through her mouth. She searched the faces in the crowd for something, anything, a flicker of doubt, a sympathetic glance. She found nothing. Renard had been at the king's side since boyhood. She had been Luna for 6 months, and before that she had been a nobody, a foundling girl, who kept the kingdom's records because she was good with ink and paper, and had nowhere else to go. This was never a fair fight. It had started with something so small. 3 days ago, Aelith had been organizing correspondence in the lower archives, the dusty ones beneath the East Tower that nobody visited because the shelves were a disaster and the candles never stayed lit. She had been halfway through a crate of unsorted trade agreements when she noticed a pattern. Certain ledger entries did not match the dates on the official logs. Small discrepancies, the kind only a record keeper would catch, a supply delivery logged twice under different names, a patrol reassignment with no corresponding order from the king. Curiosity became suspicion. Suspicion led her to Renard's study that evening, while the advisor was occupied in council. She had found the letters in a false panel behind his writing desk, 7 of them, each written in a careful hand to the Greymarsh Alpha, each containing details about Thornfeld's defenses that no outsider should ever possess. Her blood had gone cold. Reading them, the most recent letter outlined the precise location and timing of the border rotation change that Severin had approved only 4 days earlier. Only a handful of people had access to that information. Renard was one of them, she was another. Aelith had gone straight to Severin. She had put the letters in his hands and told him everything. He had listened. He had read each letter in silence while she stood across the desk, with her pulse hammering and her hands twisted together in her lap. When he finished, He had looked up at her, and something in his expression had made her stomach drop, because it was not the face of a man seeing the truth for the first time. It was the face of a man whose worst fear had just been confirmed. But not about Renard. About her. She understood later. Far too late. That Renard had already been in his ear. The advisor had gone to the king that very morning, before Aelith even knew the letters existed, and planted the seed with surgical precision, a reluctant confession. A heavy heart. Evidence that the Luna was corresponding with Greymarsh. Proof that the woman the king had taken into his bed and his life and his kingdom was selling him to his enemies. By the time Aelith arrived in Severin's study, clutching the real evidence, the trap had already closed around her. Every word she said confirmed the story Renard had told. She had been in his study. She had the letters. She knew things only someone with archive access would know. The truth and the lie wore the same face, and Severin chose the one that had been beside him for 20 years over the one that had been beside him for 6 months. Now she stood before the entire court bound and accused, and the man she loved would not even look at her. Aelith of no house and no bloodline, Severin said, and each word fell like a hammer blow. By the authority of the Thornfeld crown and the judgment of this court, I strip you of your title as Luna. Your bond to this throne is revoked. You are banished from these lands effective at dawn. If you are found within the borders of Thornfeld after sunrise, you will be treated as an enemy of the kingdom. A sound escaped her throat. Not a scream, not a sob, something worse. A small, involuntary noise of pure disbelief, as if her body could not process what her mind already understood. He had not said her name. Her real name. Not once during the entire proceeding. He had called her Aelith of no house, like she was a stranger, like the bond between them was a bureaucratic inconvenience being tidied away. Like the 6 months of waking beside him, of learning the sound of his breathing, of pressing her hand over his heart in the dark, because the steady rhythm of it was the only thing that had ever made her feel like she belonged somewhere, had simply never happened. The guards came for her. Then 2 of them, one on each side, gripping her arms with impersonal efficiency. As they turned her toward the door, she looked back one final time. Severin was already turning away, reaching for a document Renard was holding out to him. The advisor caught her gaze over the king's shoulder and smiled. Not a large smile, not a triumphant grin. Just a small, quiet curve of the lips that said, with perfect clarity, I win. Something inside Aelith's chest cracked. Not the bond, not yet, but something close to it. Something foundational. The guards marched her through the corridors and out through the eastern gate, where the night air hit her like a wall of cold water. They cut the bindings from her wrists and left her standing on the stone steps in her house dress with nothing. No cloak, no supplies, no mount. Just the dark and the wind and the distant howl of wolves in the hills beyond the walls. Aelith did not cry. She pressed her palm flat against her chest where the bond still pulsed, faint and aching, and walked into the dark. By the time the sky began to lighten at the edges, she had been walking for 4 hours. She did not look back. The attack came with the dawn. Severin was in his study when he heard it. Not the distant clash of steel, not the organized shout of a drill, but screaming. Raw animal screaming from the direction of the eastern wall. The kind of sound that meant blood was already in the air before the first alarm horn could be raised. He was on his feet and moving before his mind fully processed what was happening. The corridors blurred past him. Guards fell into step behind him, and he could hear Dryston, his beta, shouting orders somewhere to his left. As they poured out into the courtyard, the eastern gate was already burning, Greymarsh wolves. Dozens of them, pouring through the breach where the wall met the old watchtower. Exactly where the border patrol rotation left a 17-minute gap in coverage. Exactly where someone with access to the classified rotation schedule would know to strike. The battle lasted less than an hour. Thornfeld's forces were better trained and better armed, and the Grey Marsh war party had been small, a scouting force meant to test the breach rather than a full invasion. But the precision of the attack was what made Severin's blood run cold as he stood in the courtyard afterward, his sword still in his hand, breathing hard while the smoke from the burning gate drifted across the morning sky. They had known exactly where to come. They had known exactly when. Drystan approached him with something in his hand, a leather satchel taken from one of the fallen Greymarsh scouts. Inside were orders, written in a hand that Severin recognized immediately, because he had seen that handwriting every day for 20 years, on council reports, treaty drafts, and personal correspondence. Renard's handwriting. The ground beneath Severin's feet seemed to shift. He read the orders once, then again, his vision narrowing, to the neat slanted script that he could not mistake, could never mistake, detailing troop positions and supply vulnerabilities, with a familiarity that spoke of months, perhaps years, of correspondence. "Where is Renard?" Severin's voice came out low and flat, the voice he used in war councils, the one that made advisors fall silent mid-sentence. Dristan's expression was carefully neutral. "Gone, sire. His chambers are empty. His horse is missing from the stables. The stable hands say he rode out through the western gate roughly 2 hours before the attack. 2 hours before, while the court slept. While Aelith walked alone into the dark without a cloak or a coin to her name. Renard had already been running, because he had known exactly what the dawn would bring." Severin stood very still. The satchel in his hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Around him, soldiers were calling out to each other, tending the wounded, dragging Greymarsh bodies away from the gate. The smoke thickened. The sun crept higher. And somewhere inside his chest, in the space behind his ribs, where the mate bond lived, he felt a sensation he had never felt before. A hairline fracture, thin as a thread, spreading slowly through something that had been whole and warm and alive just hours ago. He had done this. He had stood on that dais and looked down at her and called her a traitor. He had watched them drag her from the great hall, and he had not flinched because he was the king, and kings did not flinch. He had believed every word that came out of Renard's mouth because Renard had been the closest thing to a brother he had ever known. And Aelith had been his Luna for only 6 months, and some part of him, the cowardly broken part that he would never forgive, had always been waiting for her to betray him, because nobody stayed. "Bring her back," Severin said. Dristan hesitated. "Sire, she was banished by royal decree in front of 300 witnesses. If you reverse the order now, every wolf who witnessed it will have questions. Then they can bring their questions to me directly, and I will answer every single one of them." Severin turned to face his beta, and whatever Drystan saw in his expression made the man take a half step back. "Find her, bring her home." Dristan left at a run. Severin stood, alone in the courtyard, with smoke stinging his eyes and the fracture widening behind his ribs with every breath. The bond pulsed weakly, a fading signal pointing east, toward the hills, toward the wild lands beyond, the Thornfeld border, where a woman with no supplies and no protection had been walking alone for hours because her king had thrown her away. He closed his eyes. Her face came to him immediately. Not the pale, shattered mask she had worn in the great hall, but the face he saw in private moments. The way she smiled when she thought he was not watching. The way her fingers traced the edges of old documents, like they were living things. The way she said his name in the dark, soft and certain, like it was the only word she would ever need. "What have I done?" It was not a question. It was the first honest thought he had allowed himself in 3 days, and it opened a door he could not close. Dristan returned within the hour. His face told the story before his mouth did. "She's gone, sire." The trackers followed her trail east for 6 miles before it vanished at the river crossing near Widow's Bend. After that, nothing. No scent, no tracks, no sign. She walked into the current and disappeared. Severin stared at him. People do not disappear. Wolves who do not wish to be found can be very difficult to track, Dresden said carefully, especially if they know the terrain. She is a record keeper, Severin's voice was rising, and he did not care. She spent her life in an archive. She does not know the wild lands. She has never spent a night outside these walls. The silence that followed was unbearable. Because what Dresden did not say, what neither of them needed to say out loud, was that the wild lands east of Thornfeld were not kind to lone wolves. The forests were thick and poorly mapped. The river was deep and cold this time of year. And beyond the river lay the foothills of the Grey Crest Range, where rogue packs and worse things hunted anything that moved. Double the search parties, Severin said. Send riders along every road east of the border. I want her trail found before nightfall. And if we do not find it, Severin's jaw tightened until the bones in his face ached. Then I go myself. By the third morning, Severin had stopped sleeping. Not because he refused to, though he would have refused if anyone had asked. He stopped because every time he closed his eyes, the bond showed him things. Fragmented images that might have been dreams, or might have been Ayla's actual surroundings, bleeding through the fracture between them. Cold water, dense forest canopy, blocking out the stars. The sound of her breathing ragged and thin like she was running. He sat in his study at dawn, the same desk where she had stood 3 days ago with the stolen letters in her trembling hands, and forced himself to read Renard's correspondence for the 4th time. Every letter was a knife. The detail in them troop numbers that had been updated as recently as last month. A sketch of the eastern wall's structural weaknesses that could only have been drawn by someone who had walked the ramparts regularly. References to an inside source that Renard referred to only as the warden. Dristan entered without knocking. The Beta's riding clothes were still damp from the morning search. The southern team found a camp, Dristan said. Cold ashes, maybe 2 days old, near the base of the Grey Crest foothills. Severin was on his feet immediately. Show me. The ride took 3 hours. Severin pushed his horse harder than he should have. Ignoring the concerned glances from the 4 guards, Dristan insisted on bringing. The bond pulsed faintly beneath his ribs, a weak and intermittent signal like a heartbeat, struggling to sustain itself. He followed it the way a drowning man follows the faint glow of the surface. She was still alive. That much came through clearly. But the connection was dimming in a way that terrified him, and he did not know whether it was distance or something worse. The campsite was little more than a shallow depression between 2 boulders where someone had built a small fire and slept on bare ground. The ashes were days old, just as Dristan had said. A few strands of dark hair clung to the rough stone where a head had rested, and Severin picked one up between his fingers and held it like something precious and breakable. She had been here, alone, sleeping on rock. He crouched beside the dead fire and studied what remained. The arrangement was deliberate. She had stacked the kindling in a tight pyramid the way the old survival manuals described, not the loose pile of someone fumbling in the dark. Near the base of the larger boulder, he found the remnants of foraged food. Pine nuts, sorted and shelled. A handful of dried berries laid out on a flat stone. She had been methodical even in desperation, rationing what the forest offered, keeping herself alive with the same quiet discipline she brought to everything. Something caught his eye. Scratched into the surface of the boulder at waist height, so faint he nearly missed it, was a series of thin marks. Not random, organized. A directional notation, the kind used in the old territorial surveys, archived beneath the East Tower. She had been charting her own course using the cartographic shorthand she had spent years cataloging for the Crown. Severin pressed his fingers against the scratches and felt something twist inside him that was not guilt, though guilt was there. It was the belated, devastating recognition that he had never truly seen her. He had seen the quiet woman who kept his records, the convenient mate who warmed his bed and did not make demands. All. He had not seen the mind behind the stillness, the fierce, stubborn intelligence that was keeping her alive in terrain that should have killed her within the first night. He remembered the evening the bond had declared itself. A formal dinner 3 months before the catastrophe. She had been seated at the far end of the table because foundling record keepers did not sit near the king. He had not even known her name. But something had pulled his attention down the length of that table like a hand turning his chin, and he had found her looking back at him with an expression of pure, startled bewilderment that mirrored his own. The bond had opened between them, like a door neither of them had knocked on. He remembered the way the room had gone silent, the way she had stood, trembling, her napkin still clutched in one hand, looking at him as though she expected to be told it was a mistake. He remembered crossing the room to her, the longest walk of his life, and taking her hand while the entire court stared. "I do not even know your name," he had said. "Aelith," she had whispered. "Just Aelith, just Aelith." As though she needed to warn him up front that she came with nothing. No title, no house, no dowry, no leverage, just herself. And he had taken her hand and thought with a certainty that shook him to his foundations that he had never been offered anything so valuable. Now he knelt beside her cold campfire in the foothills and tried to breathe past the weight of what he had thrown away. "There are tracks heading northeast," one of the scouts reported, "light footprints, barefoot." She lost her shoes at some point, probably at the river crossing. Barefoot, in the Grey Crest foothills, in early autumn when the ground temperature dropped below freezing before midnight. Severin closed his eyes and breathed through the tightness gripping his lungs. He could see her so clearly, it was almost cruel. The way she always tucked her feet beneath her when she sat in the window seat of his study, because the stone floors made her toes cold. The way she had laughed at herself for it, for being a Luna who could not handle a cold floor. The sound of that laugh had made something shift inside him, some locked door, opening a crack, letting in warmth he had not expected and did not know how to hold, and he had thrown her out into the night with bare feet and no cloak. Because Renard told him to. "Sire," Drayston's voice was quiet, pitched for only Severin's ears. "You need to eat, and you need to sleep. You have not done either in 3 days. I will sleep when I find her. You will collapse before you find her at this rate, and that helps no one." Severin said nothing. He remounted and followed the tracks northeast. The trail climbed into rocky terrain where the pines grew thick and the undergrowth clawed at their horses' legs. Twice the tracks vanished on bare stone and the scouts had to circle for nearly an hour before picking them up again. She was moving erratically, doubling back, changing direction, stopping and starting in patterns that suggested she was either lost or deliberately trying to shake pursuit, or both. Late in the afternoon, they found blood. A small smear of it on a granite outcrop at knee height, dried brown and flaking. One of the scouts crouched beside it and inhaled, then looked up at Severin with an expression the king did not want to interpret. "Hers?" Severin asked. The scout nodded. "Recent. Maybe a day old." The world narrowed. The trees, the wind, the creak of saddle leather, all of it receded until there was nothing left except the brown stain on the rock and the fracture that pulsed with dull, spreading pain somewhere deep inside him. She was hurt. She was alone and hurt in the wild lands because he had cast her out, and every hour he spent following her cold trail was another hour she spent bleeding. "We pushed through the night," Severin said. Nobody argued. They rode until the light failed, and then dismounted and walked, following the scouts who tracked by scent in the darkness. The forest closed around them, dense and black, and filled with sounds that made the horses skittish. Twice they heard wolves howling in the distance, and each time Severin's hand went to his sword. These were not Thornfeld wolves. These were wild packs that owed no allegiance to any crown. Near midnight, the bond flared. A sudden, sharp pulse of sensation that stopped Severin in his tracks. Fear, not his fear, hers. It flooded through the fracture like water through a cracked dam, and for one disorienting moment, her experience flooded into him. Cold ground beneath bare feet. The ache of exhaustion in every muscle. The taste of copper in her mouth, and underneath it all, a vast, hollow grief that made his knees buckle. She was close, and she was terrified. "Ah, this way," Severin said, and broke into a run before anyone could stop him. He found her in a cave, if it could even be called that. It was more of a hollow scraped into the base of a cliff face, barely deep enough for a grown woman to curl into, and she had pressed herself into its farthest corner like a wounded animal, trying to disappear into the rock. The moonlight was thin, but enough to see by. Aelith was curled on her side with her arms wrapped around her knees and her face hidden against them. Her dress was torn in 3 places. Her feet were bare and bloodied. Her hair, which he had last seen, pinned neatly in the style befitting a Luna, hung loose and matted around her shoulders. She did not look up when he approached. Did not move at all. For one sickening moment, Severin thought she was dead, and the bottom dropped out of the world entirely. Then he saw the faint rise and fall of her ribs, and the air rushed back into his lungs so fast it made him dizzy. Aelith. Her name came out rough and broken, and he did not recognize his own voice. He dropped to his knees at the mouth of the hollow, close enough to touch her, and did not touch her. She flinched at the sound of his voice. That flinch, small and involuntary, and full of a fear she had never shown him before, carved something out of Severin's chest that he knew would never grow back. "Go away," she said, without lifting her head. "I cannot do that. You did it 3 days ago, without any difficulty at all." The words landed exactly where she aimed them, and Severin absorbed them because he deserved everyone. He stayed on his knees. The cold seeped through his riding trousers and into his bones, and he welcomed it, because she had been feeling this cold for 3 days while he slept in their bed. He had not slept in their bed. He had not slept at all. But she did not know that, and it did not matter, because the bed existed and she did not have one. "Renard is gone," Severin said. "He fled Thornfeld the night before the attack. Grimur struck the eastern wall at dawn, exactly where you told me they would. I found his orders on one of the fallen scouts, written in his own hand." Silence. The wind moved through the pines above them, and somewhere in the distance an owl called. "The letters you brought me were real," Severin continued, each word costing him more than any he had ever spoken. "The evidence Renard presented against you was forged. Everything you said was true. I know that now." Aelith raised her head. The moonlight caught her face, and Severin wished it had not, because the woman looking back at him bore so little resemblance to his Luna that something inside him recoiled. Her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed. Her cheeks were hollow. A cut ran along her hairline, crusted with dried blood, and the skin beneath her jaw was bruised in a pattern that could only have come from a fall. But it was her expression that got at him. There was no anger in it. No relief at being vindicated. Not even pain, exactly. Just a flat, exhausted blankness that was worse than all of those things combined, because it meant she had moved past hurt and into the territory beyond it, where nothing reached anymore. "I know," she said. "I knew before you did. Aelith, I am so sorry." "For which part?" Her voice was steady and utterly empty. "For believing him over me? For binding my wrists in front of 300 people? For calling me Aelith of no house like the past 6 months meant nothing? For stripping me of the only home I have ever had?" Each question landed like a blade, precise and unhurried. She was not screaming, she was not weeping. She was listing the facts of what he had done to her, with the same careful attention to detail that had once made her the finest record keeper in Thornfeld, and somehow that was infinitely worse than screaming. "For all of it," Severin said, "for every single part of it. Then you are sorry for everything, except the one thing that actually mattered." She held his gaze, and the blankness in her eyes cracked just enough for him to see the devastation underneath. "You did not believe me, Severin. I stood in your study with the truth in my hands, and you looked at me, and you chose him. I know. You chose him because he has been at your side for 20 years, and I have been at your side for 6 months. And when it came down to it, 6 months was not enough. That is not what happened." That is exactly what happened. Her voice finally broke on the last word, and the sound of it, that small fracture in her composure, was the most terrible thing Severin had ever heard. Worse than the screaming at the eastern gate. Worse than the howl of battle. Worse than anything. He reached for her. She recoiled so sharply. Her shoulders hit the back of the hollow, and the look she gave him, the reflexive full-body flinch, away from his hand, told him something that made his chest compress, until he could barely breathe. She was afraid of him, his mate. The woman who used to reach for his hand in her sleep, who used to press her cold feet against his calves beneath the covers and laugh when he protested. She was afraid of him. "Please come home," he said, and it did not sound like a command. It did not sound like a king speaking. It sounded like begging, because that is what it was. Alith closed her eyes. "Thornfeld is not my home," she whispered. "You made sure of that." The bond pulsed between them, weak and damaged, straining across the space they had both carved between them. Her presence reached him, despite everything. Exhaustion, pain, the ache of the fracture mirroring his own. And beneath all of it, buried so deep, she probably did not even know he could feel it, a desperate longing for the exact thing she was refusing. For warmth, for safety, for him. "The bond is fractured," Severin said quietly. "You can feel it, so can I." Her jaw tightened. "Good. It will kill us both, if it is not repaired." Miravel confirmed it. "A publicly severed mate bond, especially one declared by the Alpha in front of witnesses, begins to deteriorate. The longer we are separated, the faster it decays." She opened her eyes and looked at him, and for the first time something other than blankness flickered in her expression. Not forgiveness. Not even close. But something sharper, something calculating. The record-keeper's mind behind the wounded eyes, weighing facts. "How long?" she asked. "Weeks. Perhaps less." The silence stretched between them. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain, and Alith shivered. She tried to hide it, pressing her arms tighter around her knees, but Severin saw, and before he could stop himself, he was unclasping his riding cloak and holding it out to her. She stared at it, then at him, then back at the cloak. "If I come back," she said, "it is not for you. It is because I do not intend to die in a cave, because my king was too proud and too stupid to see a traitor standing at his own right hand. That is fair, and I am not your Luna. Not anymore. You took that from me in front of every wolf in Thornfeld, and you do not get to hand it back in a cave in the middle of nowhere, like it is a cloak you forgot to pack. Understood?" She looked at the cloak one more time. Then she reached out and took it, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second, and the contact sent a jolt through the fractured bond that made them both inhale sharply. Alith wrapped the cloak around her shoulders and did not meet his eyes. "Fine," she said to the ground. "Take me back." "But I am sleeping. In the infirmary. Not in your chambers. And if Renard's replacement so much as looks at me sideways, I am leaving again, and this time you will not find me." Severin nodded. He did not trust himself to speak, because the relief flooding through him was so vast and so undeserved that his voice would have broken entirely, and he had already shown her enough weakness for one night. He stood and offered her his hand. She ignored it, and got to her feet on her own, wincing as her bloodied feet took her weight. She swayed slightly, and his hands came up instinctively to steady her. "Do not touch me," she said, quietly and without heat, and he dropped his hands immediately. They walked out of the hollow together, 2 feet apart, not touching, not speaking. The bond trembled between them like a wire pulled too tight, humming with pain and relief, and 1,000 things. Neither of them was ready to name. The guards and Driston waited at the tree line. Driston took one look at Alith, and removed his own cloak as well, draping it over her shoulders without a word. She accepted it with a small, exhausted nod. Severin lifted her onto his horse, because she could not mount on her own, and this time she allowed the contact, because there was no alternative. Her body was rigid against his as they rode, every muscle locked tight. holding herself apart from him even though they were pressed together from hip to shoulder. "When we arrive," Aelith said into the darkness, her voice barely audible above the sound of hooves, "I want access to the full archive. Every document Renard touched in the last 2 years, every letter, every ledger, every council minute." Severin frowned. "Why?" "Because the attack on the eastern wall was a scouting party, not an invasion. That was a test." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had spent 3 days alone in the wild, with nothing to do but think. "Whatever Renard is planning, it has not happened yet." The words settled over them like a second darkness. Severin's arms tightened reflexively around the reins, and Aelith shifted forward, away from his chest, reclaiming the distance. Behind them, the mountains disappeared into cloud. Ahead of them, the first faint glow of Thornfeld's torches appeared on the horizon, and the fractured bond between them pulsed with a warning neither of them could yet understand. Aelith did not sleep that first night back in Thornfeld. Miravel, the head healer, had cleaned the cut along her hairline, wrapped her feet in poultices that smelled of yarrow and comfrey, and ordered her to rest. Aelith had waited until the old woman left the infirmary, then gotten up, pulled on borrowed boots, 2 sizes too large, and walked to the archives. The lower archives were exactly as she had left them. Dusty, poorly lit, and haunted by the faint smell of rotting parchment that no amount of airing ever fully removed. She lit 3 candles, dragged a crate of Renard's filed correspondence to the largest table, and began to read. She read through the night, she read through the dawn, she read until the candles burned down to stubs, and the words blurred in front of her eyes, and then she lit new candles and kept reading. The scope of Renard's betrayal unfolded before her, like a wound being opened, layer by layer. It was not weeks of scheming. It was not months. The earliest letter she found dated back nearly 3 years, long before Severin had ever met Aelith, long before the mate bond had complicated anything. Renard had been selling Thornfeld's secrets to Greymarsh for 3 years, methodically and patiently, building an alliance that had nothing to do with Aelith and everything to do with the throne itself. She was so absorbed in the documents that she did not hear the footsteps on the stairs. "You should be resting." Aelith did not look up. She recognized his voice, the way she recognized her own heartbeat, involuntarily and without wanting to. "I am working," she said. Severin stood in the doorway, and his presence registered, even without raising her eyes. The bond registered his proximity like a compass needle swinging toward north, and something behind her ribs eased, despite her best efforts to prevent it. The constant, dull ache that had been grinding behind her ribs for 3 days lessened by a fraction, and she resented it fiercely. "I brought you something to eat," he said. She glanced up then, because the sentence was so absurdly domestic that it broke through her concentration. The Alpha King of Thornfeld stood at the bottom of the archive stairs holding a wooden tray with bread, cheese, a sliced pear, and a cup of tea. He looked entirely out of place, a man built for war councils and battlefields, holding a breakfast tray in a dusty basement like an overgrown servant. "You can leave it on the table," she said, turning back to the documents. He set it down carefully, then stood there. She sensed him wanting to speak. The bond transmitted his emotions whether she wanted them or not. Guilt and longing and a desperate need to fix something he had broken beyond easy repair. "I found something," Aelith said, because talking about the work was safer than acknowledging the man standing 3 feet from her. "Renard's correspondence goes back 3 years. This was never about me. He was building an alliance with Greymarsh long before I arrived." Severin's sharp intake of breath was gratifying in a way she was not proud of. 3 years, he repeated. "At minimum. There may be more." His filing system is deliberately inconsistent, which tells me he anticipated the possibility that someone might eventually go through his records. She turned a page, her fingers steady, even though her pulse was not. He was also corresponding with someone else, a third party. "The letters are unsigned, but the ink is unusual, darker than standard, with a faint residue that stains the paper even after the writing dries. She held up one of the pages. In the candlelight, faint iridescent marks shimmered along the margins, where no visible text had been written, like something had been inscribed beneath the ink in a substance that caught the light only at certain angles. "That is not ink," Severin said, stepping closer. "No," Aelith agreed. "It is not." Their eyes met over the page. For one unguarded moment, the distance between them collapsed and they were simply two people looking at the same problem, the way they had been dozens of times before during late nights in his study when she would read aloud from old territorial records while he marked up maps. Before everything shattered, Aelith looked away first. "I want Miravel to examine these pages," she said. "If this is what I think it is, then Renard was not working alone, and his ally was not human." The healer arrived within the hour. Miravel was a small woman with iron-gray hair and hands that moved with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years handling things that could kill her if she was careless. She took one look at the residue on the pages and went very still. "Where did you find these?" Miravel asked. "Renard's correspondence archive. There are at least a dozen more like them." Miravel held the page close to a candle flame. Not close enough to burn, just enough to warm the paper. The iridescent marks flared and then faded. She set the page down and wiped her fingers on her apron with deliberate care. "This is old magic," Miravel said. Warding script. Someone was layering instructions beneath the visible text. Whoever Renard was writing to was embedding commands into the correspondence. "Commands for what?" Severin asked. "I would need more time to determine that. But warding script of this quality is not the work of a hedge witch or a village conjurer. This is practiced, refined, and very old. Whoever created these letters knew exactly what they were doing." A cold silence settled over the archive. Aleph stared at the shimmering page and felt something shift beneath the surface of the conspiracy. She thought she had been unraveling. She had assumed Renard was the architect. A traitor, yes, but a human one with human motivations, ambition, and greed and resentment. But if someone had been layering hidden commands into his correspondence, then the question was no longer just what Renard wanted. It was what had been done to him, and what else had been set in motion that they could not yet see. "There is something else," Miravel said, and her voice dropped in a way that made Aelith's stomach tighten. "I need to examine you both." The bond. The examination happened in the infirmary in silence, with Aelith sitting on one cot and Severin on another, across the room, as far apart as the space allowed. Miravel moved between them, pressing her fingertips to pulse points, listening, testing, her expression growing more severe with each passing minute. "The fracture is worse than I expected," Miravel said finally. "A mate bond severed publicly by the Alpha carries a different weight than a private dissolution. The ritual of it matters. 300 witnesses heard the king revoke the bond. That collective acknowledgement gave the severance a kind of authority that is affecting you both on a level deeper than emotion." She paused. "Your bodies are beginning to reject each other." The words hung in the air like smoke. "What does that mean?" Severin asked. "It means the bond is not just damaged, it is actively deteriorating. The longer you remain separated, the faster the decay. Physical proximity slows it, contact slows it further. But unless the bond is formally restored with the same public authority that severed it, the deterioration will continue." Miravel looked between them. "You have weeks at most." Aelith felt the blood drain from her face. "And if it is not restored?" Miravel did not soften the answer. "The bond will collapse entirely. When it does, the shock will likely stop both of your hearts." They did not speak about what Miravel had told them. Not that night. Not the next morning, not during the 3 days that followed, in which Aelith buried herself in the archives and Severin held council meetings to organize the search for Renard. They moved through the palace on parallel tracks, close enough to sustain the bond, but never close enough to address it. And the silence between them grew heavier with every hour, Aelith noticed the deterioration in small ways at first. A tremor in her hands when she held a quill too long. A wave of dizziness when she stood up too quickly from the archive table. A persistent cold that settled in her bones and would not leave, regardless of how many blankets she layered over herself at night. She noticed it in him, too. The shadows deepening beneath his eyes. The way he paused mid-sentence during council meetings, his train of thought derailing for a fraction of a second before he recovered. The slight unsteadiness in his gait when he thought no one was watching. She always watched. She hated that she always watched. On the fourth morning, she arrived at the archive to find a fire already burning in the hearth. The old iron stove that had not worked in years had been repaired, and the room was warm for the first time in her memory. A new chair had replaced the splintered wooden one she had been sitting in, this one padded, with a cushion that someone had chosen with care. On the table beside her document stack sat a fresh candle, a pot of ink, and a small glass jar of dried lavender that served no practical purpose whatsoever. Except that Aelith kept lavender on her desk, in every room she worked in, because the scent helped her think. She stared at the lavender for a long time. She offered no thanks. She could not, because thanking him would mean acknowledging that he was paying attention, that he remembered her habits, that he cared. And if she acknowledged that, then she would have to reckon with the fact that the man who had destroyed her before the entire court was also the man who remembered she liked lavender on her desk, and the contradiction was too large to carry alongside everything else. She sat in the new chair and opened the next crate of documents and pretended the warmth in the room did not matter. But it mattered. By the end of the week, the proximity alone was no longer sufficient, and sat. Mirabelle confirmed what Aelith already suspected. The bond's decay was accelerating. They needed contact, physical touch, to slow it enough to buy time. Absolutely not, Aelith said. Then you will both be dead within a fortnight, Mirabelle replied. The compromise, reached after an hour of negotiation that felt more like a treaty dispute than a medical discussion, was minimal and clinical. Aelith would sit beside Severin during council meetings. Their shoulders would touch. That was all. Just contact. Just the warmth of skin through fabric enough to keep the bond from collapsing while they searched for a more permanent solution. The first meeting was agony. Aelith sat rigid on the bench beside him, her left shoulder pressed against his right, and every point of contact burned with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The bond drank it in, like parched earth drinking rain. She felt it strengthening between them, the fracture narrowing by the thinnest of margins, and her body responded with a relief so profound it made her eyes sting. She stared straight ahead and willed herself not to feel it. Severin did not speak to her during the meetings. He spoke to his advisors, to Dristan, to the commanders coordinating the hunt for Renard. But she noticed the way his breathing changed when their shoulders first made contact. The way the tension in his body released by increments, like a coiled spring slowly unwinding, the way his hand, resting on the table, moved a fraction of an inch closer to hers, before he caught himself and pulled it back. Days passed. The contact expanded without either of them formally agreeing to it. His hand on her elbow as they entered the council chamber, her fingers brushing his, when she passed him a document. A brief, accidental press of his knee against hers, beneath the table, that neither of them acknowledged and neither of them corrected. One evening, Aelith was working late in the archive, when the dizziness came on, suddenly sharp and disorienting, and she gripped the edge of the table as the room tilted. Severin was there before she could call for help. She did not know how he had known, whether the bond had transmitted her distress or whether he had simply been nearby, as he always seemed to be now. His hands steadied her shoulders, and the contact flooded through her like sunlight. And for one terrible, wonderful moment, she leaned into him. Just a few seconds. Her forehead against his chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, his arms coming around her with a gentleness that made her want to weep. His heartbeat was steady and strong beneath her ear, and the bond sang between them with a clarity it had not had since before the great hall. Then she pulled away, and the absence of his warmth was so acute it felt like stepping into freezing water. "I am fine," she said, not looking at him. "You are not fine. Neither of us is fine. Then we will be not fine separately." She straightened the documents on the table, with hands that would not stop trembling. "Was there something you needed?" He stood there for a long moment. His frustration bled through their connection, tangled up with tenderness and exhaustion, and a guilt so constant it had become the background noise of his every waking moment. "Dresden scouts have located Reynard," Severin said. Aelith's head came up sharply. "He is in the Greycrest foothills, in a fortified camp near the old mine workings. He is not alone." The scouts counted at least 40 Greymarsh wolves, and an unknown number of others who do not carry any pack scent at all. "No pack scent," Aelith repeated. "That is not possible. Every wolf carries a pack signature. Unless they were stripped of it deliberately." Miravel believes the warding magic in Renard's letters may be connected. Wolves bound by old magic sometimes lose their natural scent markers. The implications cascaded through Aelith's mind like dominoes falling. Renard had not simply been conspiring with Greymarsh. He had been building something, an army of wolves, whose allegiance had been rewritten by magic, whose identities had been erased. The letters, the hidden commands, the warding script beneath the ink. It was not communication. It was recruitment. "How long has he been doing this?" she whispered. "We do not know, but we found something else." Severin reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. 20. This was recovered from a Greymarsh messenger intercepted at the border 2 days ago. Aelith took it and unfolded it. Her eyes moved across the text, and the blood drained from her face so quickly that Severin stepped forward in alarm. "What?" he demanded. "This is a ritual," Aelith said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A binding ritual. And the first step, the catalyst that activates the entire sequence, is the public severing of a royal mate bond by the Alpha himself in front of witnesses." The silence that followed was absolute. "He planned this," Aelith breathed. "All of it. The forged letters, the accusation, your decision. He needed you to cast me out publicly. He needed the bond to break. That was the entire point." Severin's face had gone white. Aelith read the rest of the page, and her hands began to shake so badly the parchment rattled. "It unbinds the Alpha's power from the throne," she said. "Every wolf in Thornfeld draws strength from the Alpha's bond to the land. That bond is sealed through the mate connection. When you severed our bond publicly, you did not just cast me out." She looked up at him, and the horror in her expression was mirrored in his own. "You broke the link between yourself and every wolf in this kingdom." Miravel confirmed it within the hour. The old healer spread Renard's intercepted ritual across the infirmary table and examined each line with hands that did not tremble, though her face grew grimmer with every word. "The girl is right," Miravel said. And the use of girl, rather than Luna or Queen, told Aelith exactly how serious the situation had become. Because Miravel only dropped formalities when formalities no longer mattered. The Alpha's bond to the land runs through the mate bond. It has always been this way. It is why the selection of a Luna is not merely romantic or political. It is structural. The mate bond anchors the Alpha's power to Thornfeld itself. Without it, the connection is fraying. "How quickly?" Dristan asked from the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression the careful blank mask he wore when things were at their worst. "It has already begun," Miravel said. "The border wards have been weakening since the night of the severance. The patrols have reported disturbances in the outer forests. Wolves losing their sense of direction, becoming confused, unable to find trails they have walked for years. The land is forgetting them because the Alpha's bond to it is dissolving." Severin stood by the window with his back to the room, and Aelith could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the controlled stillness that she had once mistaken for calm. She knew better now. Through the damaged bond, She knew what that stillness actually contained. A storm of self-recrimination, so violent it made her chest ache, just receiving the echo of it. "I did this," he said quietly. "Renard did this," Aelith corrected before she could stop herself. "He engineered every piece of it, the letters, the timing, the evidence, against me. He spent 3 years building toward the moment you would stand in that hall and do exactly what he needed you to do." Severin turned to face her. The raw anguish in his expression was almost unbearable. "But I chose to do it," he said. "He presented his case, and you presented yours, and I chose his. That was not his hand, that was mine." The room went quiet. Driston shifted uncomfortably. Mirabelle busied herself with the documents. Aelith held Severin's gaze and felt the truth of his words settle between them with a weight that pressed the air from the room. "Yes," she said, "it was." She offered no softening. She could not. The wound was still too fresh. The memory of standing in that hall with bound wrists too vivid. But something in the way he received her words, absorbing them without defense or excuse, just standing there and letting them land, made the knot wound tight inside her, loosen by a fraction she had not expected. Mirabelle broke the silence. "The question now is whether the ritual can be reversed. The severance was the catalyst, but the full unbinding has not completed yet. If the mate bond is restored before the ritual reaches its final stage, the Alpha's connection to the land should re-anchor." "How?" Driston asked. "The same way it was broken, publicly before witnesses. The Alpha must claim his Luna, and she must accept the bond willingly. Both conditions are required. The magic will not hold. If either party is coerced." Every eye in the room turned to Aelith. She felt the weight of their gazes like a physical pressure. The kingdom's survival, reduced to a single question aimed at a woman who had been dragged from this very palace in bonds less than 2 weeks ago. Would she take him back? Would she stand in that hall again, in front of the same wolves who had watched her humiliation, and bind herself to the man who had ordered it? "I need air," Aelith said, and left the room before anyone could stop her. She made it to the eastern courtyard before the tears came. Not the quiet, controlled kind she had permitted herself in the cave. These were ugly, ragged sobs that tore out of her chest and echoed off the stone walls and left her gasping on a bench beside the garden wall with her face in her hands. She cried for the girl who had been found on the castle steps as an infant, no name, no parents, nothing. She cried for the woman who had spent her entire life trying to earn her place through usefulness, through work, through being so indispensable that no one would ever have reason to throw her away. She cried for the Luna who had stood in a hall full of wolves and discovered that none of it had been enough, and she cried for the bond, for the way it had felt before, whole and warm and steady, like a hand holding hers in the dark. Yo. For the way it felt now, cracked and fading and shot through, with pain that belonged to both of them. A sound behind her. Footsteps, slow and careful, stopping several paces away. "I am not following you," Severin said. "Driston told me you came this way, and I am here, because there is something I need to say to you that I should have said before any of this happened." Aelith wiped her face with the back of her hand. "If this is another apology, I have heard enough of them." "It is not an apology," he paused. "It is an explanation, not an excuse. I will never have an excuse. But you deserve to understand why I believed him over you, and the reason is not what you think." She neither told him to leave, nor told him to stay. She sat on the bench with her ruined face and her aching chest and waited. Severin remained standing, several feet away, his hands at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it, stripped of authority and command and everything that made him sound like a king. "I lost my mother when I was 7, he said. "She left. Not died. Left. She walked out of the palace one morning and never came back. My father told the court she had been called away on family business. He told me the same. I waited for months. When I was old enough to understand, I learned that she had left of her own accord, that she had chosen to go, that whatever she found in the world beyond these walls was worth more to her than what she had inside them. Ayla's breath caught. In 6 months as his mate, he had never spoken about his mother. She had assumed the woman was dead. Everyone assumed the woman was dead. Renard was the only person who stayed, Severin continued. After she left, after my father retreated into himself, and the court turned cold, Renard was the one constant. He was there every day, every year. He never left. His voice roughened. So when he came to me and said that you, my mate of 6 months, were betraying me, some part of me was not surprised, because some part of me has been expecting that from every person I have ever cared about since I was 7 years old. The courtyard was very quiet. The evening light had gone amber and soft, and somewhere in the garden a bird sang a phrase and then fell silent. I believed him because believing him was easier than believing that I had finally found someone who would stay, Severin said. And I know how pathetic that sounds, and I know it does not justify a single thing I did to you. But you asked me why. That is why. Alith sat very still. The cost of those words reached her without sound. The doors he had opened that had been locked for decades. The vulnerability of standing in a courtyard and telling the woman he had wronged that his deepest fear was the thing she had confirmed when she vanished. She had not vanished by choice. He had sent her away. But the result looked the same from inside the wound of a boy whose mother walked out when he was 7. You are right, Alith said quietly. That does not justify what you did. I know, and it does not earn you forgiveness. I know that too. She looked at him. Then, really looked at him. Past the king, past the alpha, past the man who had destroyed her in public, down to the raw and terrified thing beneath. All of it, the boy who had been left and had never recovered, who had built an entire kingdom around himself like armor and called it strength. But it helps me understand, she said. Something broke in his face, not dramatically, not with sound, just a small collapse of the muscles around his eyes and mouth, the kind of fracture that only happened when a person had been holding something for so long that the simple act of being seen was enough to undo them. He did not cry. She thought he might. She almost wished he would. The restoration, Alith said. Miravel said, I have to accept the bond willingly. Severin nodded, not trusting his voice. I am not ready, she said. I do not know if I will ever be ready. But I also do not intend to let this kingdom fall, because one man's treachery exploited another man's wounds. She stood, her legs unsteady, her ribs tight, with something that was not quite forgiveness, but was no longer pure fury. I will do it for Thornfeld, not for you. Do you understand the difference? Yes, he said. Good. She turned toward the infirmary door, then stopped. Without looking back, she said, Your mother was a fool, for what it is worth. She heard his breath catch. She walked inside before he could respond, because if he said anything kind, she would break entirely. And she could not afford to break. Not now. Not when Reynard's ritual was still unfinished and the kingdom's bond to its alpha was dissolving with every hour, and the fractured thing between her and Severin was the only thread holding all of it together. Behind her, in the courtyard, Severin stood alone in the fading light and pressed his hand flat against his chest where the bond lived, and felt it pulse with something fragile and new that he did not dare name. The restoration was scheduled for the following evening. Miravel insisted they could not wait longer. The bond's deterioration had entered a phase she described as cascading, in which the rate of decay accelerated with each passing hour. 2 more days, she estimated, and the damage would become irreversible. The great hall was prepared with the same formality as the severance. 300 wolves assembled beneath the vaulted ceiling, the same stone walls, the same banners, the same faces that had watched Aelith dragged out in ceremonial cord barely 2 weeks ago. Aelith stood in a chamber off the main corridor, dressed in the dark green gown that Mirabelle had found for her somewhere, and tried to make her hands stop shaking. She could hear the murmur of the assembled court through the stone walls, hundreds of voices blending into a low, restless hum that vibrated alongside the weakened bond. The door opened. Dryston stepped inside, his expression carefully measured. "The hall is ready," he said. "The king is waiting." Aelith looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall. The cut along her hairline had scabbed over, but was still visible. The shadows beneath her eyes were deep enough to look like bruises. She looked like a woman who had been through something terrible and come out the other side. Thinner and harder, and less willing to pretend. "Driston," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When he cast me out, were you surprised?" The beta was quiet for a moment. "No," he said honestly. "I was not surprised that he did it. I was surprised at how completely wrong he was. You knew I was telling the truth?" "I suspected. But it was not my place to override the king's judgment in open court." He paused. "I should have found a way regardless. That is something I will carry." Aelith nodded slowly. She appreciated the honesty more than she could express. Everyone else had been offering her reassurances and apologies and promises that things would be different. Dryston simply acknowledged what had happened and did not try to soften it. "Walk me in?" she asked. The hall fell silent when she appeared in the doorway. 300 heads turned. 300 pairs of eyes fixed on the woman who had last stood in this room, with bound wrists and a broken voice. Aelith felt every single one of those gazes like salt pressed into an open wound, and she kept walking. Severin stood at the center of the hall, not on the dais this time. He had come down to the floor, to her level, and the significance of that choice was not lost on anyone. He wore no crown. His hands were empty. When he saw her approaching, something in his expression shifted, a flicker of awe and terror and desperate hope that he could not quite hide. Aelith stopped 3 feet in front of him. The distance felt immense and insignificant at the same time. "Aelith," Severin said, and this time he used only her name. No title, no house, no qualifier, just her. "I stand before you, and before every wolf in Thornfeld, to say what I should have said before. Any of this, I was wrong. The accusations against you were false. The evidence was forged by a traitor who has fled these lands. Every word you spoke was the truth, and I chose to believe a lie over the woman who had given me nothing but honesty since the day our bond formed." His voice carried through the hall, steady and clear, but the bond betrayed what it cost him: the humiliation of public admission, the vulnerability of standing before his own people and declaring himself not just mistaken, but fundamentally, devastatingly wrong. "I ask you now, not as your king, but as your mate, to accept the bond between us once more. Not because the kingdom requires it, not because duty demands it, but because I failed you, and I want the chance to spend the rest of my life making sure I never fail you again." The hall held its breath. Aelith looked at him, at the man who had destroyed her and then ridden into the wild lands to find her, who had knelt in the dirt outside a cave and begged, who had told her about his mother in a courtyard and left himself more exposed than she had ever seen another person be. She opened her mouth to say the words she had rehearsed for Thornfeld, for the kingdom. The safe answer, the political answer, the one that protected her heart behind a wall of duty and practicality. But what came out was not that. "I accept," she said, "because I choose to, not for Thornfeld, for you." The words surprised her as much as they surprised him. She watched them land on his face, watched the shock bloom into something incandescent and disbelieving, and felt the bond between them surge with a warmth she had almost forgotten. Severin reached for her hand. She let him take it. Their fingers interlocked, and the contact sent a shockwave through the fractured bond that every wolf in the hall felt simultaneously. a pulse of energy that rippled outward through the hall like a wave of heat from an opened furnace. For one perfect suspended moment, the world was right. Then the floor shook. It started as a vibration, subtle enough to be mistaken for a distant tremor. Then the candles in the hall flickered and died, every single one of them at once, plunging the entire hall into sudden darkness. Gasps and shouts erupted from the crowd. Aelith's grip on Severin's hand tightened. Every letter Renard had ever sent through this palace, every document he had touched, every page with that shimmering residue hidden beneath the ink. They were activating, all of them, all at once. Aelith felt it through the bond like a hook sinking into her chest. The dark magic latched onto the fracture between them and pulled, wrenching the bond open along the crack that the public severance had created. Pain exploded behind her ribs, and she heard Severin make a sound she had never heard from him before, a raw, involuntary cry that was not anger or command, but pure agony. The hall erupted into chaos. Wolves, shouting, shoving toward the doors, guards trying to maintain order. But Aelith could not move. The magic pinned her in place, driving into the bond like a wedge into split wood. And through the darkness and the pain, she could feel it working. Feel the connection between Severin and the land beginning to tear loose from its foundations. Feel every wolf in Thornfeld weakening as the Alpha's power was ripped away from the throne. Severin's hand was still in hers. His fingers crushed her knuckles, holding on with a strength that bordered on desperation. "Aelith," he gasped, "I can feel it. The land. It is letting go of me." She could feel it too. Through their clasped hands, through the shattered remains of the bond, she sensed the ancient connection between the Alpha and Thornfeld unraveling like thread pulled from a loom. Each strand that broke sent a tremor through the stone beneath their feet and dimmed something in Severin that she could only describe as his presence. The immense gravitational force that made him feel like a king, even when he stood in a room alone. He was being unmade, and she was the only anchor he had left. "Do not let go," Aelith said, and pulled him closer in the dark. The darkness was not natural. It pressed against Aelith's skin with weight and intention, thick as water, cold as grief. She could not see the hall anymore, could not hear the shouting, could not feel the stone floor beneath her feet. There was only Severin's hand in hers, and the bond between them, cracked and bleeding light through its fractures like a lantern with a broken pane.
"Where are we?"
Severin's voice came from beside her, close and strained. Aelith did not know, but she recognized the feeling, the same heavy, suffocating wrongness she had sensed in Renard's letters, in the warding's script, in every trace of the dark magic that had been woven through Thornfeld for 3 years. They were inside it now, inside the ritual. The magic had pulled them into the space between the bond and the land, the place where the Alpha's connection to his kingdom lived, and it was destroying everything it touched. The darkness shifted, and shapes formed around them. Not walls, not landscape, memories. She saw the great hall, herself standing in the center, wrists bound, every face in the court staring. Severin on the dais above her, his voice filling the room with words that ended everything. She watched her own face crumble, watched the guards take her arms, watched herself look back one last time, and see Renard's small, terrible smile. "Stop," Severin said, his voice ragged. "This is not real." "It is real," Aelith whispered. "It happened." The memory dissolved and reformed. Severin as a boy, 7 years old, standing in a doorway watching a woman walk down a long corridor without looking back. The boy's face was blank in the way that only a child's face could be blank when it was absorbing something too large to process. He did not cry. He did not call out. He stood and watched and folded the pain into a place so deep inside himself that it would take 20 years and a shattered mate bond to reach it again. "She just left," Severin said beside her, and his voice was no longer the king's voice. It was the boy's voice, small and bewildered and asking a question that had no answer. She did not even turn around. The dark magic was feeding on them. Aelith understood it now. The ritual did not just sever the bond, it consumed the pain of the severance, used it as fuel. Every wound between them, every fracture, every moment of betrayal and abandonment and loss was being drawn to the surface and amplified because the magic needed their suffering to complete the unbinding. And they had given it so much to work with, new memories. Aelith, as an infant on the castle steps, wrapped in a blanket with no name pinned to it. Aelith at 12, watching the other children from the archive window during the harvest festival, always watching, never joining, because foundlings did not belong in the dancing circles. Aelith at 20, being told by a senior archivist that she should be grateful for her position, because girls with no family did not usually amount to anything at all. "You were so lonely," Severin said, and the pain in his voice was not pity, it was recognition. "So were you," Aelith replied. The darkness pressed harder. More memories. Severin reading Renard's accusation for the first time and feeling the sick, familiar certainty that of course she would betray him, because everyone did. Aelith, walking through the eastern gate in the dark, and feeling the sick, familiar certainty that of course she would be thrown away, because she always was. Two people, locked in the same cycle, from opposite ends, each confirming the other's worst belief about themselves. "This is what it wants," Aelith said. "It wants us to believe that this is all we are, broken people who break each other. And if it is true," Severin's hand was trembling in hers, "it is not the whole truth." She turned to face him in the dark. She could barely see him, just the outline of his jaw and the faint gleam of his eyes reflecting the dying light from the fractured bond between them. But she could feel him. Through the bond, through the contact of their hands, through the strange and terrible intimacy of standing inside each other's worst memories and seeing everything. She had seen everything now. The boy at 7, the man at 30, the king who had stood on a dais and thrown away the best thing that had ever happened to him because he was too terrified of losing it to let himself keep it. She had seen all of it, and it did not erase what he had done to her. It did not make the great hall disappear or unfeel the ceremonial cord on her wrists. But she understood now, with a clarity that burned through the dark magic, like fire through fog, that his wound and her wound were the same wound. And the only way to heal it was not to pretend it did not exist, and not to use it as a weapon against each other, but to choose each other in spite of it. Not once. Not in a grand public ceremony, before the assembled court. But here in the dark, in the place where every reason to walk away was laid bare and magnified and screaming. "You are the man who cast me out," Aelith said, "and you are the man who rode into the wild lands to bring me back. You are the boy whose mother left, and the king who was too afraid to believe anyone would stay. I have seen all of you now, every broken piece, and I am still here." She squeezed his hand. "I choose you," she said. "Not the version of you that never makes mistakes. Not the king on the dais. You, the real one. The one who is terrified right now." His breath shuddered. Something in him gave way and she felt it as if it were her own. Not a wall crumbling. Nothing so dramatic. More like a door opening, a lock releasing. After years of rust, a single quiet admission that he had been waiting his entire life to hear someone say those words and mean them. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I knew it the moment the words left my mouth in that hall. I knew, and I said them anyway, and I will regret it for the rest of my life." "I know," Aelith said, "and I forgive you, not because you earned it, not because the kingdom needs it, because holding on to this is killing us both, and I am tired of being the woman who expects to be thrown away." The bond flared. Not the weak, sputtering pulse they had been sustaining through proximity and stolen contact. This was something else entirely. The fracture that had been widening for 2 weeks sealed like skin closing over a wound, and heat poured through the connection between them, golden and fierce and absolute. Aelith gasped. The warmth flooded through her chest, her limbs, the spaces behind her eyes where exhaustion had been living. She felt Severin's answering surge through the bond, felt his hand tighten around hers, felt the Alpha's power roar back to life. As the connection to the land re-anchored itself through the restored bond, the darkness screamed. It was not a sound that belonged in any natural world. It was the sound of something ancient and parasitic being torn from its host, and it shredded through the air around them as the dark magic convulsed, contracted, and collapsed inward. The warding scripts burned out. Every hidden letter, every compromised document, every trace of Renard's 3-year web of manipulation ignited with a cold, white light that blazed through the hall for a fraction of a second before extinguishing into nothing. The candles roared back to life. The floor stopped shaking, and Aelith was standing in the great hall again, hand in hand with Severin, surrounded by every wolf in Thornfeld, who stared at them in stunned silence. The bond between them hummed, whole and warm and undeniable, radiating outward through the hall like heat from a fire. Every wolf in the room registered it. The Alpha's connection to the land, restored. The Luna's place beside him, sealed. Severin looked at her. His face was streaked with tears. He had not known he was shedding, and he was smiling in a way she had never seen before, open and unguarded and full of something, so vast it did not fit in his expression. Aelith smiled back. It was small and tired, and not without reservation, because forgiveness was not a door you walked through once. It was a choice you made every morning when you woke up beside the person who had hurt you and decided again to stay. But it was real, and it was hers. Severin leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face like she was the most fragile and valuable thing in the world. The bond pulsed between them, steady as a heartbeat. "Stay," he whispered. "I already told you I would," she whispered back. 300 wolves erupted into the howl of recognition, the ancient sound that acknowledged a bond restored and a Luna reclaimed. The sound shook the rafters and rattled the banners and echoed off the stone walls until the entire hall vibrated with it. Aelith stood in the center of the great hall, in the exact spot where she had been broken, and let the sound wash over her. She refused to flinch. She refused to look away. She held her mate's hand and stood exactly where she was. The weeks that followed were not easy. Forgiveness was not a single act, but a daily practice. And some mornings, Alith woke beside Severin and felt the ghost of the ceremonial cord on her wrists, and had to breathe through it until the memory loosened its grip. She told him on those mornings. She did not hide it or swallow it or pretend. She said, "Today is a hard day," and he listened, without defending himself, without explaining, without asking for absolution. He simply stayed beside her and let her feel what she felt. Renard was captured 3 weeks after the restoration, found hiding in a Grey Marsh border settlement, with a collection of warding scripts and a look of absolute disbelief that the ritual had failed. His trial was public. Aelith sat in the gallery and watched the man who had nearly destroyed everything answer for what he had done. She felt nothing when the verdict was read. Not satisfaction, not relief. Just a quiet, firm sense of something finished. The kingdom healed slowly. The border wards rebuilt themselves as the Alpha's connection to the land strengthened. The confused patrols found their bearings again. The forests settled. The wolves of Thornfeld, one by one, felt their bond to the Alpha click back into place like a compass, finding north. And Aelith kept the archives. She went back to her records and her ink and her candles, because that is who she was before she was Luna, and it was who she intended to remain. Severin never asked her to be anything else. He visited the lower archives most evenings, bringing tea and sitting in the chair beside hers and reading reports while she catalogued documents. Sometimes they talked, Sometimes they didn't. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of things unspoken, but the silence of two people who had said the worst and the truest things they would ever say to each other and come out the other side still holding on. One evening, months later, Aelith looked up from her work to find Severin asleep in the chair beside her. His head had tipped sideways against the backrest, and a report lay open across his chest, rising and falling with each breath. The candlelight softened the hard angles of his face into something unguarded, and young and deeply at peace. She watched him for a moment. Then she reached over and pulled the report gently from beneath his hand, set it on the table, and returned to her work. She did not wake him. There was no reason to. He was safe, and he was here, and for the first time in his life, he was sleeping like someone who trusted the world not to disappear while his eyes were closed. Aelith dipped her quill in the ink and kept writing. The archive was warm, and neither of them was going anywhere.